All right, so in the interest of time, since we're all here, I will kick us off. So hello, everyone. For those of you just joining our conference for the first time, welcome. For those of you who are with us this morning, welcome back. My name is Miriam Israel. I'm the student chair for today's panel. I'm so excited to welcome you all to our second panel of the day, Faith in Climate Advocacy, Religion as a Resource for Climate Action. As I'm sure many of you know, the accelerating impacts of climate change really demonstrate the need to understand how religious communities are impacted and understanding climate change and what their roles might be as advocates. Our panelists today will share their own experiences doing this work and best practices for engaging with religious communities to craft equitable and effective global climate policy. Following the panelists' presentations, we will have an audience Q&A, so please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function. Please note that you are not able to submit questions anonymously. And if you'd like, we can read out your name when you ask a question. We will also post the full bios of our panelists into the chat for your reference. And I would now like to turn it over to introduce our moderator, Reverend Susan Hayward. Reverend Hayward is the current Associate Director of the Religion and Public Life Program at Harvard Divinity School. She also previously served as Senior Advisor to the Religion and Inclusive Societies Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. We're really grateful to have her here with us today. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to you. Oh, you are on mute still.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you. And you missed the most important part, which is that I'm also a Fletcher alumna, and I'm so grateful that this initiative on religion, law, and diplomacy exists now. It did not exist when I was a student, and it's wonderful that there's an initiative and support for students who are interested in these really complex questions about religion and how it intersects with international law and diplomacy and the pressing global issues that we're facing, like the climate crisis. So I'm going to start off by just briefly introducing our three wonderful panelists, but I encourage you to look at their full bios that are pasted in the chat. First, we're joined by Dr. Erin Wolf, who is a professor of geography at Oregon State University and director of the program in water conflict management and transformation. Second, we have Ms. Nana Fearman, who is the current senior ambassador at Green Faith, where she uses her background in urban resilience and natural disaster response to lead advocacy efforts. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Erin Lotus Viviano, a professor of theology focusing on energy ethics and faith-based environmentalism at St. Elizabeth University, and currently a senior management of the Laudato Si animators program. So as you can see, we've got a wealth of experience and expertise that is being brought to this discussion today, and looking forward to starting off by hearing from our three speakers, and then we'll have a period of discussion. And as Miriam invited you to, please do send your questions into the chat box, and we will attempt to get to as many of them as possible. But even if we're not able to get to all of them, we will make sure that our panelists see all the questions and responses that you send in. So first, Dr. Wolf, if I could start with you, and you could share a little bit with us to get us started, telling us about your work at the intersection of climate action and faith.
Yeah, thanks so much, Reverend Hayward, and thanks to Miriam and the organizers for doing this. This is such a critical conversation to be having, and a critical time to be having it, and I'm very honored to be included. So I just want to add some things to my bio. I want to make sure that it's clear that I'm from the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. I'm in a land grant, space grant, sea grant, sun grant university. I'm a scientist with so many science credentials, I can't even tell you how much of a scientist I am. And I want to then tell you how I went awry and fell off the science wagon to understand faith constructs and faith tools as profoundly important ways to think about having better dialogue around these critical issues of climate. And my particular perspective is water. And so I started, I understood that water and politics were tied to each other. And I, like a lot of Western folks, I thought, okay, I gotta be a really good scientist, and I'll just bring scientific understanding to the problem of shared waters, and all the politics will just dissipate and go away. And the very first issue I was dealing with, I remember it was a plume of pesticides that was moving from a cranberry bog to a municipal well. And the people of the municipality hired us. I was working for a government agency at the time. And they said, how long is this plume going to take to hit this well? And so we did all of our science, and we did our modeling and our coring and our sampling. And sure enough, we found out fairly confidently that the plume would hit the well somewhere between 5 years from now and 50,000 years from now. And so on the one hand, scientifically, hydrogeologists go, oh, wow, good job, 4 orders of magnitude, that's pretty good. But on the other hand, in terms of a policy recommendation, it's all but useless. And so this was kind of my first foray into the fact that science is a good basis, but that the answers we provide are limited to the actual questions on the table. So then I went back and tried to learn about conflict resolution, because I got that a room full of angry people was something that I needed to understand better. And again, my training in the West was around the Getting to Yes school. There's a very rational approach to conflict resolution. You separate the people from the problems, you invent options, objective options for evaluation. And again, a very rational optimizing exercise. And then I went and started to practice, and again found that it was really useful, but that the actual rooms full of people who had to resolve these very, very difficult and fractious conversations had no interest in rationality, that there was something else going on. And what I would notice would be there would be moments of, and I can only call them as transformation. I have 2 images. One is of a watershed the way scientists see it, where the only boundary is the watershed itself. And it focuses on what unites us, what brings us together. Everything's connected to everything else. And the other image is the same watershed the way people see it or engage with it. And that's with all the boundaries, with the state boundaries, with the ethnic boundaries, with the things that separate us. And so when I would have a map of people's watershed and I would take the borders off the map, suddenly that was one of these moments of transformation. There's no other way to describe it. Everybody got, oh my gosh, I don't know where I am. And then, oh my gosh, we really are connected. And I was talking to a friend who, and I'll get to the reason why in a minute. I had no idea he had a deep spiritual life. And I said, what is it about these moments of transformation? Where do we learn about these things? And why are these 2 images so evocative? And he said, I found out later, is a deeply practicing Baha'i. And he said, you know, it kind of feels like a metaphor for spiritual transformation. Isn't this what faith traditions try and get us to do? Is we're focused on our boundaries, our separateness, our individuality, and they're trying to get us to see the world without the boundaries, to recognize our connections to each other, whether it's through humanity, shared humanity, or if it's in your language, through shared divinity. And all of you heard all my scientific credentials, all of my Western science flags went up. And I said, and then he said, even worse than that, he said, why don't you go hang out in faith communities and spiritual communities and find out how they understand the world of conflict and conflict resolution as a scientist, to see if there aren't tools and frameworks and constructs that could be useful in our world of negotiations and diplomacy. All the flags go up. We don't talk about faith. We don't talk about science. And there I started to understand the real rift that what we call the Enlightenment had left, is that very consciously, we had separated out the worlds of rationality, the things that we can gauge and measure and metricize, and the worlds of spirituality. You could have your faith tradition, but you do it in private, at home, with your Friday, your Saturday, Sunday community. You don't bring it into public discourse, and you definitely don't let it influence public policy or public discourse. So as a scientist, I listened to him and I thought, you know what? First of all, oh my gosh, I can't possibly do this. I'm a scientist. But then, you know what? I've got tenure. I can do it. Nobody can fire me. Nobody can. And as a scientist, oh my gosh, what a great question. How do we understand these worlds of transformation in a way that we can think about better dialogue and diplomacy? And so that was an 8-year process, which in parallel, I was deepening my own spiritual practice. I consider myself a bit of a Jubu, very deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition, but flavored by Buddhism and the silence that Judaism tends not to value so highly. So that was an 8-year process, and the result is the book that's there in my in the intro, and so I think I maybe that's enough. I'm not quite sure how much time. I want to leave plenty of time for engagement, and but this is now where I've been, is understanding the kinds of skills that I've been learning and have found profoundly useful in our better conversations is first of all listening. Westerners and scientists as a whole are deeply poor listeners, and faith traditions offer a way to listen from the heart in a way that we're hearing shared values, we're hearing pain. Even though the words are angry, we're hearing vulnerability, we're hearing pain, and we're able to craft conversations around these shared vulnerabilities. So now when in the climate space, for example, all my scientist colleagues here, they're convinced if only we get the science right, if only we can get those last 2 significant figures of science right, everybody will get the climate story, and understanding that that's not the point at all. Let's meet people within their narratives, within their constructs of their own world, where they don't trust you or your science, but they see the world changing. So how do we talk about adaptation together? How do we but set aside the things in the climate space where we disagree? How much is people caused, how much is not? For so much of what we need to do, it deeply doesn't matter. Let's fix our infrastructure. Let's create more resilient communities. Let's figure out how to adapt to the changes that we all recognize. And it's the same with any of the big issues of the day. So learning how to listen to each other, learning how to sit. When I do a lot of work in formal negotiations, and people sit like this, which is the worst possible way to enter into a dialogue, is you see everybody, all their anger and all their frustration and every raised eyebrow. And when we pray side by side. So what happens if you take 2 angry people and you just set them side by side and encourage just a little bit of listening? Doesn't that recraft the entire conversation? So thinking about this merging of, in Kabbalistic world, there's the world of the closed space, the bounded space that we have, and the open space. So the worlds of Din and Chesed, or left brain, right brain, if you will, and reminding ourselves that they sit together in the heart, that it's the heart, that it's our tuition, that it's our tapped in nature that allows us to find a common truth, that allows us to weigh both the worlds of rationality and spirituality, and to find a way forward in shared values. So I think that's plenty. Again, I'm sorry if I've gone too long, but that's a bit of my own path, and where I think this kind of dialogue is so critical to helping us have the conversations we need to have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolf. There's a lot there that I'll be eager for us to dig into more fulsomely during the discussion, but I especially appreciate you raising the legacy of the Enlightenment in how it assumes some false binaries and has had us policing around those binaries. And I think there's a lot of great critical scholarship and engagement over the past couple decades that has had us questioning that in ways that allow us to then see how these what we have assumed to be secular processes of negotiation and conflict resolution that have led us towards a very logical, rational, technical approach to it might be limited and not based on the reality of how people make decisions. And so I'll be particularly interested to hear a little bit more about what you've discovered about how different faith traditions understand their relationship with the environment and water and the various practices and how those come into the negotiations when we get to the discussion. But first, let's hear from our other two panelists. So Ms. Nana Firman, and we'd love to hear from you next about your experiences working both at the local level in Indonesia, but also with the global community and more recently in some of your work. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Reverend Hayward. And well, I would like to greet everyone first with the Islamic greeting, Assalamualaikum, greeting of peace to everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the school for inviting me today. I'm Nana, and please allow me to introduce myself a little bit before we begin. So I was born in the rainforest region of Central Sumatra in Indonesia, the home of Sumatran tigers. But I was raised in the capital city of Jakarta. And I've been living now in California for the last 10 years. But I was born in a practicing Muslim family. However, like many people born into a certain religion within their culture, I took everything for granted and didn't think much of it until in my college years, which I spent in the US, when I started question many things and explore more into the Islamic teachings and traditions. But not until the year, the 2000, after the 2004 earthquake and tsunami in the northern tip of Sumatra, the Indian Ocean tsunami, when I was invited by the World Wildlife Fund to do a scoping mission in that region. And later they asked me to lead the Green Reconstruction Program to ensure that the recovery process after the massive disaster was done in a sustainable way. When I was really then confronted even more, discovering deeper on the Islamic teaching and tradition related to the environment, the environmental protection, because back then I think my mindset was, doing everything in the scope of conservation and sustainability and nothing to do with religion. But I was forced to communicate with the local community in the religious narratives, because that was something that is dear and near to them. And because of that situation, it forced me to actually went back to learn my own faith, and then went back to explore in the Holy Quran and also in the prophetic tradition in the Sunnah. So that's how I got into this. And if we see today, there is no denial that the climate change and environmental degradation is an existential threat to our planet, and all genuine scientific studies continue draw our attention to this global warming. And with all the increasing frequency of extreme weather events like forest fire, hurricanes, floods, and others, that most likely as the consequences of human activities over a period of time. And we are alarmed by this vast gap between what is required to limit this catastrophic global temperature rise and the actual climate change commitments made by many actors, mostly like the governments, like global governments. And after decades of knowing exactly how serious the climate crisis is, this gap between what is needed and what is happening is morally incomprehensible. So, and like other Abrahamic faiths, in Islam also, we are taught that humans are stewards and protectors of this planet. Like in Arabic word, it's called Khulafa al-Ard. And there's like many verses in the Quran and also like in the prophetic tradition which directly or indirectly deal with this environmental and natural world. And there is a scripture that really like struck me when I was actually the experience was I was giving a presentation about how to live more greener to children. So some of their mothers were there to accompany the children, and one of them was my friend. So I was explaining to them about to live, lightly and eco living and about ecological footprints. But then after that, a friend of mine told me that what I was explaining is actually mentioned in the Holy Quran. I had no idea about that. So she explained to me and then pointed the verse like to walk gently on earth. And I was struck. So I went find an imam and asked the imam, like, was that right? Like what I was doing, what I was presenting, what I was teaching to the children is actually mentioned in that verse. And then he said yes. So I got like my my endorsement there that I had no idea all those time. So there's a lot of like events like that. I was not I guess like Dr. Wolf also, like, it was not my intention to do that, but it was just like, like it happens like, from, like different moments. So, but then like, like recognizing this event, this severe impacts, like back to the climate issue, it is like, like unprecedented, like globally, this threat that, that we have to face in our society, in this planet. And so I helped to organize the 2015 with Muslim scholars and environmental leaders in Istanbul to produce the Islamic Declaration on Global Climate Change, to call Muslims at all levels to tackle the habits, their mindsets, and also the root cause of climate change that cause, like all this degradation and all this lost biodiversity, and also like this all this what we are facing right now. And that happens like exactly 2 months after Pope Francis released an encyclical Laudato Si. And so we understand that this global warming requires international government cooperation, because there's no way that we can work individually. So, but individual and community action is also necessary to change the tide of this situation. So we also work with community. I also encourage like communities, mosques, to play an important role also in understanding and also confronting this and reducing the impact. And so last year, this is my other reflection. Last year, the Islamic New Year's, the 1443 Hijrah, was commemorated on August 9th. And at the same time, it was the release of the IPCC report, which sadly laid out this disastrous environmental impact report on our planet natural system, that they call the report as a code red for humanity, where corporation, governments, cultural and religious forces are not doing enough. It's just the fact. So in many places, it's actually worsening. So I was reflecting on that what is hijrah mean in the Islamic, in the Islamic tradition, which is actually the commemoration of when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, moved from Mecca to Medina to escape persecution. And then like he established the Muslim community there. So that was like a very dear and close, like near to all the Muslim community. Everybody knows about that history and that tradition. But then we also looked that up. Hijrah is not just a physical transformation, but it's a mentality, it's a constant process, it's philosophy, it's how we live by. So it's a constant doing. And then yet nobody's talking about like how should we make the hijrah because of what we are facing right now because of climate crisis. So I was calling, like since last year, I was calling to the Muslim community to make an eco hijrah, because now like our hijrah is not just, it's no longer just physical, but we have to change this mentality, like the way we see things. And if we don't do that, and that's not going to make any difference. So it's a state of mind. So then I post these questions to like my Muslim communities, and also like network, that how could we as an ummah, as a community, transform such wisdom into practice, and then like looking at this current planet devastating condition. So making hijrah towards climate justice, that's why I posted, and it's to move beyond just individual effort. And I believe this is an important part of diplomacy, like, since we're talking about diplomacy today. So, and then like most of Muslim, like other faith tradition also, like, we are united on the like fundamental belief that all people, all living things, God creation and the earth are sacred. And in fact, the prophetic sayings put the earth as the sacred place of prayer. And he also called the earth which in Arabic term, it means mother. So we must respect, we must care and protect like we do to our own mothers. But these are like sometimes the disconnect that is happening, that we are trying together, like, like I guess like I want people to experience what I experience, that, like for those who take everything just for granted because you are born in a certain religion with a certain family and like tradition, and then you just take it, for granted, and you never really explore more. And then with the current situation, I think like we can post that, and I am at the moment also like have a lot of like discussion and conversation with my Muslim sisters and brothers, as well as people of other faiths, to how can we make our practice of our faith more relevant to in trying to solve this problem today and to make a better future. So, for example, like every year we observe Ramadan, the month of the sacred month of fasting, and many years people just like as Muslim, you fast for the whole month, and then like for Ramadan enjoyed it, and that's it. You don't really think about it, but actually Ramadan is the time of reflection, the time to stop, to put a hold on something. So I'm promoting also this year, like, besides like, stop from eating, drinking, or other things that is not allowed during the daytime. Like, how about like we think about, can we fast from using like, or reducing the use of fossil fuels, for example? That's a little bit like, I guess like, I'm not sure like how is the reaction. So like I'm preparing for, in the next 2 months, we are going to enter the month of Ramadan. So that is what we are like kind of like having the conversation right now with like some of the climate Muslim climate activists. Like, how can we post this to make the also like the understanding and awareness to our people, as well as like to bring this issue of climate justice, because what's the purpose of fasting if we're not going to embrace this justice issue and also compassion. So I think like that's what I can share at this time, and I'm looking forward for the discussion with other speakers and also with the participants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Furman. And I really appreciate your own individual personal example of the ways in which you drew from your faith tradition in order to understand the values and the practices in support of climate change, or in support of climate action. And as well, how you're working within the Muslim community. I love this idea of fasting from fossil fuels during Ramadan. But what you're saying, it does dovetail nicely with what Dr. Wolf was saying in terms of recognizing the deep transformations that can take place when you draw from within spiritual well springs and faith traditions in order to elicit these kinds of values and practices. And it strikes me as particularly important because of the very need to address climate change is going to require deep transformations, both of individual behavior, but also of social behavior, economic behavior, political behavior. It's going to require really fundamental shifts in how we relate to one another and to the earth and to various systems. So the importance of recognizing how faith, spiritual commitments can elicit that kind of transformation, I think is critically important. So thank you for highlighting that. Our third speaker, Dr. Biviano, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be among the excellent panelists here, and my thanks to the organizers for creating a conversation on such an important topic. And I'd like to share thoughts on how faith communities can be a source of renewable energy and a resource for climate advocacy. Next slide. So very recently, the impacts of climate change have become more and more unavoidable. For a long time, people would find it easier to hide their heads in the sand, but in recent times, not so much, as here in the United States, we see devastating impacts on a regular basis. And of course, they're happening constantly around the world. Next slide. This has been the focus of sustained work by faith-based environmentalists for years and years. And actually, I invite any of you who might be present in the auditorium together to look at each other and ask the other, have you ever heard of faith-based environmentalists? And I bet many of you perhaps have not, but we've been out there for decades. And there are many coalitions, there are many organizations that reflect the particular faith traditions of their people. Nana has been a member of Green Faith for so long and taking so much leadership as well within her Islamic community. There are evangelical faith-based groups, many of them. One I love is Kanfei Nesharim, Torah Living for the Environment, an organization of Orthodox Jews who are dedicated to sustainability. Of course, I, at this time, represent the Laudato Si movement, a global Catholic movement for eco-spirituality, sustainability, and advocacy. So we've been working and doing so for a long time. Next slide, please. And a huge impetus to this work has been the publication of Pope Francis's Laudato Si. Now, there have been teachings from all faith traditions for decades, from their hierarchies, from their imams, from their pastors, from their bishops, and from popes. Dozens and dozens, thousands of articles from eco-theologians, ethicists, philosophers. But what we have in Laudato Si is a singular, high-profile, very authoritative letter entirely devoted to the socio-environmental crisis. And it's his global critique of our system of production and consumption and our spiritual malaise that enables us to have indifference towards the climate crisis, and an invitation to see how this connects to our own faith and our own lives. Next slide, please. It's truly a call to look at the global inequality of climate change, the disproportionate impacts of emissions upon the poor, the disproportionate suffering of regions in the global south as the global north has disproportionately emitted it's over far more than its share of emissions. as this map shows, with the top showing those nations that have emitted the most greenhouse gases, and the bottom map showing those countries distorted in proportion to their experience of impacts, such as malaria, floods, droughts, etc. Next slide, please. And as all of you know, this is a geopolitical crisis. It results in violence, in conflict, in disease, in climate migration. It's a threat multiplier. It affects local economies, global economies, supply chains, and local livelihoods. And people view these issues very differently depending on where they sit and what sort of stakeholder they are. Looking at this case study of the violence in the oil fields of Nigeria, according to the Africa Oil and Gas Report, the focus is upon the vandals. From the point of view of a Catholic cardinal, this is an ethical crisis calling oil companies to accountability and justice. Next slide, please. Of course, it's a health crisis, calling for all sorts of policies and education, transformation of our urban environments, of our transportation systems. This graph indicates some of the effects of air pollutants upon developing children, and of course, living children. We all know about the asthma, the neurological developments, the school absenteeism, etc. Next slide, please. And to this, the faith response is a theological protest, that the rich and poor have equal dignity, as Pope Francis writes in Laudato Si', that the spirit of the universe, the spirit of life, dwells in every living creature, that every creature has dignity, beauty, and intrinsic value, not simply an economic value or an instrumental value. That we exist in a cosmos founded upon love, that God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things. Next slide. So Catholics responded very positively to Laudato Si'. 72% of Catholics trust Francis for information on global warming. 35% of Catholics say that the Pope's position on global warming has influenced their views about the issue. And of those who have been influenced, half say the Pope's position on global warming has made them more concerned about global warming. And there was also a very strong international and interfaith positive response to Laudato Si'. Many faith communities issued their own statements of support. Of course, this was an influential document before the Paris Accords, etc. Next slide. In the United States, Catholics do not tend to see a conflict between science and religion. Regular mass goers who have been surveyed do not see a conflict between their faith and science. However, it's interesting that very traditional regular mass goers are least likely to say that climate change is a very important problem or that they have a moral responsibility to respond to it. So here it gets complex. Next slide, please. Why is this? Well, as one of our commentators has asked, can half the church take on the mission of the whole church? Or bluntly put, can the liberal left, who traditionally takes up causes like environmentalism, carry this call, which comes from our highest moral authority and is issued to every person on the planet to care for our common home? Next slide, please. So we have a crisis of partisanship, which is all too clear to every American, the divisiveness, the political partisanship that divides our country. And sadly, this division exists also within faith communities. So there are multiple levels of confusion, misunderstanding, and division that challenge our ability to move forward together. Now, these gaps, as I call them, do not exist only in the church. They exist in wider society. The most influential factor in one's environmental position are one's political views. Political views trump faith views. So it's essential to appeal to shared deep faith values when inviting people to take that step of transformation, to look upon their moral obligations in a broader sense as including the earth. So just as Dr. Wolf spoke about a scientist's hope that more detailed facts, finding greater data would resolve our problems, answer all the questions, and move us to resolution. Sadly, that's not true. Similarly, the presence of authoritative teachings do not lead instantly to action. We have plenty of moral teachings from every faith community. All faith groups around the world have issued statements and have teachings. Yet, less is done than we would like. Why is that? This became the focus of my research when I was at the Earth Institute, and the results of that research are in my book, Inspired Sustainability. And what I discovered by conducting focus groups among 26 groups of diverse faith communities is that they share a very strong scientific literacy. They share a strong sense of interdependence. They're committed to social justice. They see a bigger God in a moral universe that includes the earth. They have a reverence for creation. They value interfaith connections and collaborations. And they are independent thinkers, able to take new steps into a brand new world of ecological spirituality and be the leaders and the pioneers in that field for their congregations. Next slide, please. So with that, they're able to step over three gaps: the gap of not knowing enough, the gap of not caring enough, and the gap of inaction. Please skip the next 3 slides in the interest of time. And let's land on the next slide. Faith communities are able to address some of these gaps because we know that preconceptions, which are often political preconceptions, literally filter information, prevent people from hearing what is actually spoken and goes into their ears. They do not hear it. Faith values help to bridge those divides. Common, deep, shared values ground people in something that's meaningful to them, with which they identify, a social group that they're bonded with, and this helps them to receive new information about climate change. Climate change can be intimidating and overwhelming, and receiving it in a faith context offers consolation and hope. And moral faith communities offer a moral correction to overconsumption and indifference. People are used to examining their behaviors and trying to do better and cultivating new virtues. And these new virtues and habits and lifestyles can be shared within a community. So next slide, please. I will skip over this, though it's so important, the concrete teachings that faith traditions offer. Next slide. Next slide, please. And I'd like to conclude by observing that faith communities are really sources of renewable energy in their hope, in their virtue, in their willingness to examine behaviors, in their companionship, social social dynamics, and the ability to be persistent and take hope, even while they are engaging in challenging advocacy and difficult transformations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm hopeful that during the discussion, you'll have an opportunity to sneak back in some of those slides that you had to skip. First question is actually going to go to you because I want to double check. Do you prefer to go by Dr. Lothis or Dr. Biviano?
Dr. Lothis, thank you.
Dr. Lothis, okay. So thank you for that presentation, for highlighting the issues of climate justice and inequality that, like the pandemic, the climate crisis has both revealed the inequalities that currently exist, but also exacerbated these inequalities. And that's a vital component that needs to be addressed in terms of climate action. But also this false notion that we have that ideas necessarily lead to positions and actions, when it's far more complicated than that in how people make decisions and how their actions are transformed or not based on that. So thank you. As we move to the discussion period, we have questions that have come in, but I'm going to do moderator's prerogative and throw out a question to each of you. Let me throw out the 3 questions, and then we'll do the quick round robin, and then we'll turn to some of our audience questions. Before I do so, though, I just want to make one point, which is that the purpose of this panel is really talking about religion as a resource for addressing climate action. But we know that religion has often served as a barrier to climate action as well, in terms of particular religious ideas that have driven some of the technocratization that Dr. Lothis was talking about, that has contributed to the climate crisis, as well as opposition from different religious groups to actions in order to address climate justice. And so even as we highlight the resources that are available within religious traditions, I want us to continue to hold that as well. And we might be able to talk about that more within the discussion. But I don't want to pass over that too quickly, that fact. So a question for each of you. Dr. Wolf, first of all, the international community has developed real standards for negotiation and for best practices for addressing the climate crisis, in particular issues of water and land protection. And I wonder if you could share with us, based on your exploration of different faith traditions and their particular ideas and practices around water specifically, or the environment more broadly, about what you would say faith traditions have to offer, particular faith traditions have as a whole have to offer in terms of potentially shifting some of our understanding of what the best practices are for negotiations and for climate justice actions. Ms. Fierman, for you, I'm curious, we talk a lot about resiliency within the work of climate science and climate work generally. And the idea of resiliency as it applies to ecosystems is their ability, of course, to kind of bounce back or adapt and transform in response to shocks. But this term has a larger salience for social systems as well. I'm curious, based on your experience, both in the grassroots in Indonesia and responding to climate crises, but also more broadly, about what you think religion has to offer in terms of material and immaterial resources in promoting resiliency of environments and of human and larger systems as well. Because of course, unfortunately, we're going to face more and more crises as a result of climate change. And so this question is pressing of how we respond to, adapt, and prove resilience, even as we're seeking to transform these systems in order to mitigate the climate crisis. And for Dr. Lothis, for you, I'm curious, with the Catholic Church's actions on climate change, led by, inspired by, framed by Laudato Si, is powerful. And of course, part of the power of the Catholic Church is its broad institutional reach across the world. But it's complicated, right? Because the Catholic Church's broad institutional reach around the world is related to historical movements like colonialism and imperialism, that for some religious communities, and I'm thinking particularly of indigenous communities in the Americas or elsewhere, were seen as something that contributed to where we are now with the climate crisis. So I wonder, what you're seeing or what the opportunities are for the Catholic Church's action on environmental care, how that can be in part of efforts as well with reconciliation with Indigenous communities and partnering with, working with Indigenous communities and addressing this climate change. So it can be both addressing climate change, but also an opportunity for real reconciliation. So Dr. Wolf, back to you.
Terrific, thank you. So you asked me about best practices in negotiations, and I think there's a couple. Again, I want to come back to the Enlightenment and the world that it's left. What we forget, those of us who were embedded in it, is that it's a very recent distinction between rationality and spirituality, and it only happened in very specific locations. So much of the world still thinks of this as an integrated whole. Our being, our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual beings all are in balance with each other, and have developed processes both within faith traditions and local and indigenous traditions that incorporate these. And so the best practice at the high diplomatic level is deeply informed by this Western right or wrong, legal, metricized, almost a deification of a metricization. If you can measure it, it's legit, and if you can't, it's not. And yet at the local level, worldwide, you have these more holistic processes that are more about the community. They're more about what's shared. So in the Palestinian community, you have the sulha, where somebody who does something wrong comes to the community and asks for forgiveness. And there's a process by which the perpetrator is re-embedded in the community. And so it's this balance of rights and honor, of self and other, of justice and mercy. And so we have this kind of high level diplomacy informed by Western law. And then we have these local processes. And now we're at this horrible juncture where all of the problems are taking place right in the middle, where these two scales interact. And so what I think one of the more powerful things to be a part of, and I think this movement is a part of it, is to reincorporate those local values up into the international arena. And this is something that I do in all of my water talks, is to remind us we have 4 waters. We have physical water, the water that we touch, that we move. We have a mental water that we calculate, that we measure, that we make efficient. But we also have emotional water, water tied to history and sovereignty and power and justice. And then we have spiritual water, where it touches, and every spiritual tradition uses water for spiritual transformation. So as soon as you incorporate that within dialogue, it elevates the conversation. Everybody gets it. And I think one of the things I'm trying to get my scientific colleagues to do is talk about their faith. Within the scientific community, we've been convinced that you can't even touch this stuff. And maybe you can't until you get tenure, but it's so powerful. There's so many scientists out there who have deep, deep faith traditions. And only when you start to talk about it do they kind of look around and go, yeah, me too, don't tell anybody. But the more we talk about it, I think it elevates the conversation and bridges the trust barrier that we have with a lot of the people who are skeptical.
I appreciate that a lot, Dr. Wolf. Thank you. I particularly think that it's important both to get scientists talking about their faith, but also as a religious studies scholar, I would say as well, important talking about their ideas about religion and their assumptions about religion too, because even if they're not people of, or they wouldn't describe themselves as a person of faith, they're definitely often have particular ideas of what religion is that might be whether intentional or not, shaping how they respond to people of faith and to thinking about what religion has to do with climate crisis in a way that might be really limiting. So I really appreciate what you offer there. Ms. Fearman.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, we also looked at a lot of religious practices have become like divorced from the inner meanings and has been transformed into just normal habitual acts and lacking of spirituality or like even being present. So that's what we are trying to bring back to like, like this spirituality, the meaning. It's not just like for example, I give the example about Ramadan, like, like day in and day out, every year the Muslim practice fasting, but then like, are we really like, like having this spirituality during Ramadan? What does it mean? Like, like for our time today. And in terms of that, I think like what we offer as like faith faith communities and from faith tradition is hope. So I think that is what the ingredients that sometimes like when it's being explained in a scientific way or political way or economic way, like people cannot like feel that the hope. I think like what the ingredients that the faith tradition and teaching can offer during this difficult time is hope. That's where people like, like hang on their faith tradition. And also like more and more I see that because many of faith tradition, including the Islamic community, we are always in the in the business of humanitarian aid. When the big disaster happened, who are the first in the front line? Always faith-based institution or organization that help people. So when we're talking about climate change, that's going to be a lot of these things is going to happen, and a lot of changing is going to happen. So a lot of humanitarian, faith-based humanitarian efforts also trying to engage this disaster risk reduction, and also include this climate conversation in their way of doing the aid at the time being, but also trying to build like from our own community, from our mosque, from our circles, to have this like like having a system where something happened, we have a way of helping each other, as well as try like to hang on there. It's not like like we're not going to just forget about it, but this is like what I think like what we can offer as the from the faith tradition is first hope, and also like the social like close knit of the society within like within the faith tradition or the communities. Because like if we go to like traditional Muslim communities, everybody's life is linked to the mosque, like the local mosque, the small mosque, not the big one. So that's where we actually like now I see this like already like in the humanitarian groups, they're training people to have this kind of like support system. So then if something happened because of the climate change, what can we do? But also not only that, but what can we do to reduce the impact, and also like what to also like to educate people what is the root cause of this, by understanding that we are asking them also, let's transform ourselves, let's change, and also like to speak louder to their government, to make the change. So it's not just like doing like doing the beyond the individual the individual transformation, but also as a society transformation, and talking about system like the Pope said. And I think like one more thing is about like I'm also like talking to like the Muslim faith leaders in terms of like in Islam there is the fatwa, which is the religious edict. Nobody's like talking about what is the grave implication of fossil fuels so far. So I'm always like trying to sort of like provoking these ideas to many of our faith leaders to please like let's talk about this fossil fuels, because by the impact of the use of fossil fuels for sometimes now in our earth, we already see the implication, and this is not the correct way. And another thing that I forget is about resources. Many of faith tradition, like institution wise, they have a lot of resources in terms of, their they have schools, universities, not just house of worship, hospitals and other things that they own. And then probably also they have investments. That how can we also bring that to have like responsible investment, that having something better for the future. So like eco investment or whatever we want to call it, instead of supporting deforestation, for example, like investment that support deforestation. So or using more fossil fuels. So we're trying to transform that also. And then we can always go back to the teaching of our own faith tradition, like that in the what I mentioned earlier, that there's so many in the Islamic tradition. And even I'm not trained as the religious expert, but even I'm as a lay person, I can understand. So how about the religious leaders also take a responsibility to explain to the common people about the teaching. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you wittingly or unwittingly answered one of the questions from our audience members about the particular role of hope, and for you as an activating agent that leads people to these kinds of transformative work. But I also really appreciate your point about frontline actors are often faith-based actors and organizations. So when there's hurricanes, when there's earthquakes, when there are these different disruptive environmental activities that have been triggered and exacerbated by climate change, it's the faith-based groups on the ground that are often those who are the first responders in terms of humanitarian aid and food aid. And so recognizing the material ways in which religious groups respond, and then thinking as well about some of these immaterial contributions like values and hope and so on that allows communities to move forward is important. Dr. Lothis.
Well, I think you've raised a very important and complex question, as persons have multiple dimensions to their existence, as do societies and nations. A person is both a person of faith, a person within a political system, a person with an economic trade, and all of those forces interact. So a historical dynamic such as colonialism is not simply one driven by religious forces or simply driven by political goals. They're intersecting, sometimes fused dynamics. At the same time, we can separate out some strands of them. And in the tragedies, the evils of colonialism, there were many members of the church, priests, missionaries who were a part of those experiences, who denounced them, who wrote letters home to the kings, who pleaded for the people, and were not the decision makers. Many of these were military decisions, not necessarily taken by church leaders. And at the same time, there were strong church blessings given to this. We're all familiar with the papal bulls, etc. What we have seen in modern times is repentance, a rejection of these models. And I've shared with your program leadership some links to brief discussions of official apologies from the Pope for the evils of colonialism and for the injustices suffered by the indigenous. So it's clearly a question of too little, too late, but at the same time, it's not always clear that secular entities have made these apologies, have made these recognitions. The Pope has also quite quite deliberately reached out to indigenous communities, especially in his native Latin America, hosting a special synod on the Amazon and reaching out to the entire Amazonian people as the special guardians of that region and looking to preserve their unique cultural heritage. So as I'm sharing this, this appeal for people to sign a petition to go to the COPs, it points to the spiritual power of eco-conversion, of seeking justice, of acknowledging what we've done wrong and attempting to do better. And so to Nana's point, there are so many material resources. Actually, if we could go back to that and show the next slide, in the schools, in the universities, in the hospitals, in the clinics and after school centers, the nursing homes, there's enormous scope for action. The church is one of the greatest holders of real estate globally. And as a result of writing Laudato Si, has created an action platform, a Vatican issued action platform with 7 sustainability goals that it is inviting every sector of society to engage in. And this plan is being shared globally with Catholic churches, dioceses, schools, universities, hospitals. So it's a global template for sustainability action, which could have a truly transformative effect if it takes off. So I think that it's really important to look at the complexity of persons, the complexity of historical events, and see the different factors that lead to decisions in any one case.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of looking and acknowledging the complexity, and I'm hopeful about the opportunities for the collective work on climate justice and climate care to be an opportunity for bridging faith communities and different global communities as well. So we have a number of questions that have come from the audience, and I'm gonna throw out several of them now and give you an opportunity to answer to them. From Bob, and this is a question for you, Erin. Can you give an example of how to bridge between different faith-based beliefs when practical trade-offs are present? So for example, a trade-off between massive building of infrastructure, like a wind or solar project, can be seen as essential to confront the climate crisis versus those who see all forms of nature as sacred, indigenous communities in particular. And
Reverend, just to clarify, you have 2 Aarons on your panel.
This is for you, Dr. Wolf.
Okay.
Thank you. Good reminder. Seen as essential to confront the climate crisis versus those who see all forms of nature as sacred, requiring strict preservation. So when you have different faith positions, but you're going to have to make a practical decision as part of a negotiation related to water protection, how do you balance those things? I know for you, Dr. Lothis, there was a question that you wanted to take a moment to address in particular. Excuse me while I scroll here to find it. This was a question from Peter. Can you elaborate a bit on your points that political views will override faith commitments, and where can we learn more about this? And then one question that I'm going to throw out for anybody who wants to tackle it is, this is from Vern, how have apocalyptic theological perspectives influenced or impact spiritual thinking on climate change and other ecological issues? So rather than calling on anyone in particular, maybe I could mix it up a little bit and ask if Dr. Viviano or Ms. Fearman would like to go first.
Sure, I'll
Sorry,
take
Dr. Lothis. I did it again, Dr. Lothis.
That's quite all right. I would say that there's such an important role for sociology of religion here. We need interdisciplinary tools to help us analyze people's backgrounds. The Pew Center has done marvelous research. The Yale Center for Climate Communication and the George Mason Center for Climate Communication, I think it's called, have all done marvelous work. And then there's just the field of sociology of religion, sociology of environmentalism, climate psychology. These subfields are actual disciplines, and there's a lot of research within them. But for quick and dirty results, I would say go to Pew, the Pew Forum. In terms of the question about apocalypticism, I think that played a role for some evangelicals in the United States, maybe more in 10, 12 years ago than now. Environmentalism has really spread within the evangelical community. There are multiple environmental groups within the evangelical community, and they are really powerful. They bring the same passion to their environmentalism that they bring to their religious practice. Many young evangelicals are very green. So I think that the view that, you know, if this is all, if the earth is falling apart, well, it's God's will, or we're all meant for the rapture. I think that played a role for some groups, but I think that's waning in power now. And I don't think it was ever significant in mainstream Protestantism and not in Catholicism. And I don't believe that's significant in other Abrahamic religions.
Thank you, Ms. Fearman.
If I can just add on that, so in maybe like not directly apocalyptic theology, but a lot of like even big disasters, sometimes when it happens, like the tendency of faith communities kind of like call it as an act of God. So acts of God when it's, you know, disasters happens, and as if every disaster is attributed to God, and so I think this kind of like thinking is shifting now, that we also educate our like local like Muslim like clerics, that, you know, when they have sermons and you know, like teaching also to the community, like especially in the grassroots, not to kind of like having this like, you know, like attribute the disaster as acts of God, but look at on our own behavior. And then there is, you know, like due to this pandemic in corona, like of coronavirus, there is a particular verse in the Quran that mentioned that corruption or destruction has happened in the land and the sea because of human hands. So like, you know, human activities. And as the climate, like Muslim climate activists, we've already used that verse for so long to explain about climate change, but somehow people like kind of, you know, like they didn't get it. But once the corona, like, you know, the coronavirus hit, suddenly all the clerics, all the Muslim leaders used that verse to explain about the virus. And then I said, boom, that's the one. I said, like, can you like use that also to explain what's happening with this climate crisis? So that's the conversation starts like, you know, like, so I don't know, like, you know, if we call this pandemic as a blessing of disguise also, because a lot of things people started to like, you know, looked around and like realize, you know, like that we are already disconnected from our natural world. So then there is a lot of like calling and trying to protect the earth, you know, like our relationship with the earth, with water, like Dr. Wolf mentioned, like, you know, like as Muslim, we make wudu, ablution, before our 5 times daily prayer. But yet, like, do we really think, like, how do we use the water? How much do we use the water? Do we use it, you know, like really like consciously? Because the prophet lived in the desert area, and he made the saying that even if you're in the running water, you cannot waste water. So, and somehow like Muslims forget about this saying, and then this pandemic actually recall a lot of teaching and like making people like reflect a lot. So maybe it's not that like it's not exactly apocalyptic, but something big happened that kind of realize like make people realize, and then they kind of go back to their traditions, and then look it up, and then have a like looking at the teaching and the tradition in a different meaning.
Thank you. And Dr. Wolf, the question about trade-offs.
Yeah, thanks. So Bob asked, how do you bridge if there are different faith traditions that are looking at different outcomes? How do you bridge that? And I think that's true in negotiations, whether faith-based or not. That's the whole point of negotiations, is how do you deal with upstream development versus downstream rights? How do you deal with development versus sustainability? And I think that the couple of things I'll just say, one, incorporating faith and faith leaders at the outset helps elevate the conversation. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we're very used to when we are working with indigenous communities, that they'll regularly start the conversation with a prayer and welcoming us onto tribal land. And we're very comfortable with that. And I think getting more comfortable with inviting faith-based communities across the board. I work a lot in the Middle East, and I've been in conversations where they're opened by a rabbi, an imam, and a priest, all of whom are talking about the importance of the issue from their respective tradition. And it helps us enter into a conversation at a higher level. It's not yours versus mine. And then initially, and this is what most facilitators will do, you start the conversation with the shared values. You don't start the conversation with where the divisions are. But what do we share? Let's talk about how we're going to gauge success. And invariably, you'll end up with everybody in the room wants justice. Everybody in the room wants sustainability. Everybody in the room wants honor. And as you list those, then when you come to your negotiations, you keep coming back to these. So then the question is not, is it the dam or environmental protection, but how do you encourage sustainable development while protecting the natural environment? That's a very, very different question. And whatever comes out of that conversation, you keep coming back to those shared values. Does this meet our named value of sustainability, of justice, of honor? And that's the way you have these conversations. And I've seen it work between Arabs and Israelis and Indians and Pakistanis. I mean, the most vociferous conversations going on in the world. We're so focused on the things that divide us and regularly forgetting just how much there is that unites us.
I appreciate that example. And as you noted already, it's a very different approach from the getting to yes approach, the sort of starting with the values and then coming back to the values constantly and shaping the solutions. I deeply appreciate that. There's another question that came in from Tim that I'm going to use as something of our closing question. We wanted to try to close this panel a little bit early for the sake of those who might need to run to the bathroom before the keynote begins at 2 p.m. Eastern. So Tim asks, how can you overcome the irreducible anthropocentrism of all the Abrahamic religions? This is the core of the problem, says Tim. Everyone feels they are chosen for conventional, confessional, or prophetic reasons, but there is no such thing as a chosen species in a functioning ecosystem. So I would love to have each of you reflect on this from your personal wrestling within your own native religious traditions. And it gets back to what I was saying earlier, that religions are complex, and there's both ideas that can foster care for the environment, but also ideas and understandings that can be, if interpreted a particular way, a barrier to this. So how do you particularly wrestle with this idea that humans are the center of the universe, created as stewards in a way that can lift it above ecosystems and in a way that might differ from an understanding of humans' relationship to the environment that can promote environmental care? Dr. Wolf, would you like to go first on this one?
Oh, sure.
You're unmuted, so.
Well, it's a great way to go out. I think the idea of us as separate and elevated beings is one way to kind of look at creation. And I don't think I think in all of our traditions, as we get deeper, those distinctions start to dissipate. And so as I understand, when I go deep into kind of Kabbalistic teachings or Sufi teachings or Buddhist teachings, I start to understand that that the apparent distinction between us as individuals is an illusion. And so recognizing, I mean, Einstein said basically everything is either energy or potential energy. And it's like, okay, I get that. And then we take the next leap and say, okay, once we recognize the relationship between energy and consciousness, everything in the universe is either consciousness or potential consciousness. So the understanding that I get is, I'm going to put it in Sufi terms, the way I understood it, is that at the first level, at the Sharia level, we understand what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. Then we move to Tariqat, the prayer of the heart, and we learn what's yours is mine, what's mine is yours. And then we move up to the level of absolute truth, of Hakika, and we learn there is no mine, there is no yours. But finally, at the level of Marifa, of attunement, we understand that there is no me and there is no you. And that's the place where I think we really need to come. It's not about us. There is a universal connection, and it's incumbent on us to protect and heal it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lothus.
Well, this has been a famous and appointed critique, and it's been addressed by dozens upon dozens of theologians, and a ready resource is the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology bibliographies. You can find thousands of articles that delve into this question, but I will say that feminist theologians have seen a source for this anthropocentrism in Platonic dualism, the marriage of Hellenism upon Hebraic thinking, which really is more grounded and earthy, that the ancient people, far from having a relationship of dominion over the earth, were in a very vulnerable position vis-a-vis the earth. And that an interpretation of dominion is a misinterpretation of the Hebrew spirituality of serving and tending the garden, that as created in the image of God, we are to be the loving caretakers of the garden. We are not its masters. We maintain and serve it on behalf of God the Creator. So this view of anthropocentrism is truly a distortion of the Genesis message. And Laudato Si has a nice exposition of this teaching. And most of all, what Laudato Si and many other writers put out is a spirituality of communion, of solidarity, of sister and brotherhood, following the spirituality of St. Francis, who looked upon the whole creation as sisters and brothers, you know, sister earth, brother water, sister moon, brother sun, brother caterpillar, sisters leopard, that we are all kin with creation, and how wrong it is to launch ourselves into a position of superiority, dominance, or even worse, exploitation, that this is unacceptable.
Thank you. And Ms. Fearman.
Yeah, I just want to add, because Dr. Wolf already said it beautifully between Sharia, Tariqat, Hakikat, and Ma'rifat. But I would like to just relate to what Dr. Erin Lutz mentioned about that everything is created, like in the Holy Quran, it's mentioned that everything is created for the purpose of worshiping God in this case. And so there is no creatures that moving on earth, either animals or vegetations or are like, you know, but there are just communities like you. That's the verse. Like, so like us. So then, we are not like more superior than the other creation, but then we have the responsibility to make sure that like we don't destroy the earth, and then also like to maintain the balance, the most important thing, because other creatures, they're not they're not going over the board. Only human going over the board, over the limits. So that's why this is like a reflection to us as human, that we're not going over balance, because everything that is created by God on this, in this life, is for the purpose of worship. And also there are communities just like us. So that's I think that's my addition to other wonderful answers.
Thank you. I love the way we ended this, because it actually comes back to a couple principles that we often talk about in the program that I'm a part of, that was mentioned at the beginning, the Religious Literacy and Professions Initiative at Harvard Divinity School. And a couple of these principles are that, one, all religions are internally complex, and two, that religions are culturally embedded. And we heard both of that here, that in answer to this question, that of course religious traditions are vast and internally plural, and that there are these in the Abrahamic traditions, these historically dominant positions of anthropocentrism that potentially have been dominant over the past few years. We could hypothesize about that for days, but connected to some of these political and economic interests and movements. But that's not the only interpretation of humans' relationship with the environment and place within the universe that exists within each of these traditions. And so perhaps part of the work of supporting climate action is about mining our traditions for these long-standing theological interpretations and positions that that challenge the dominant anthropocentrism of historical theological narratives within the traditions, but as well the culturally embedded piece, that this anthropocentrism is also related to different dominant understandings within Platonic and Hellenistic views that might be related to, but also distinct from, some of the what we would define as the religious inspiration or roots of those traditions. So I love that it ends with reaffirming some of these principles of religious literacy that we need to bring to understanding how religion intersects with issues of climate, of public health, of law and diplomacy more largely, much less religion and science as we're talking about for the conference as a whole. So I'm going to hand it back over to the illimitable Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou to take us forward, and hopefully with a couple minutes here to spare in case folks need to run to the bathroom before our keynote speaker, with many thanks to Dr. Wolf, to Dr. Lothes, and to Dr. Fierman for their contributions today. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, and thank you, Reverend Dr. Haywood. We have a couple of minutes before our 2 o'clock keynote, so please don't forget to come back, take a couple of minutes, and then we'll begin again at 2.